point is the effect on voters that polling has. So if we prove this to be true, then we prove that polling has an overall negative effect on voters by preventing them from making an informed decision on election day. First of all, polling distracts voters from policy and draws their attention to public opinion. This is a very, very clear demonstration of the logical fallacy ad populum, where people irrationally make decisions based on the opinions of others rather than on logical metrics. So we believe that in a democracy, it is essential that people make decisions based on their own observation of political events, not based on the opinions of others. We believe this gives the best representation of the opinions of a populace, and that is the best for democracy. So this polling is bad, even if the polls are a perfect representation of society, because it prevents people from doing this. It prevents people from forming their own opinions and voting based on their own perspective. Even if the poll is a perfect representation of society and there's no bias, they're still likely to encourage people to take the opinions of others, which we believe is bad for democracy and against the democratic principle. A really good example of this recently was the Indigenous Voice campaign in Australia, which was a referendum. The constant bombardment of polling, literally like 3 or 4 times a week, had a tremendous effect on the outcome of the referendum. And that case is a very clear example of people taking the opinions of others rather than listening to the facts, and that was a big issue. The second thing is that polling is a poor representation of society in 99% of cases. The first way this can happen is direct bias and manipulation. So as it's often conducted by media outlets with a political bias, a lot of media outlets have a political bias, actually the majority of them do, that makes bias really easy. It makes it really easy for bias to get into their polling. Yes?
If you have the fiat to completely ban these polls, do we have the fiat to regulate them?
Well, the topic is that we are supporting banning the polls. I'm not sure what your counter model will be. I think we'll respond to your counter model when you've actually delivered it. So the first way that these polls can have bias is manipulative questions. So media outlets can manipulate the questions to make people lean in a certain way based on their political opinions. The second thing is a manipulative sample. That means that, they actually sample people from a certain group that they believe will likely agree with that political opinion. 2 very, very easy ways. It happens not just in political polls, it happens everywhere whenever you try to do a survey. It's a very easy way to manipulate that. So this means that the polls themselves can be politically biased with the intention of exploiting people's tendency to vote based on what others believe. So media outlets can exploit, because they're aware of this tendency, they know that people are susceptible to this, they can exploit the tendency to vote based on other people's opinions to push a political agenda. Very clear way polls can be manipulated and be biased. Or maybe they're not doing that, maybe they're just simply trying to spread misinformation. In both cases, it's bad. The second way that polls can be manipulated is general failings in polling process. This is not a intentional bias. This is just bias that comes because of general failings. Even if a media outlet tries to be completely unbiased, this can happen. So we still believe polls aren't a good representation of the population in this scenario. We believe, first of all, this is because similar types of people are likely to respond to the polls conducted by media. If a very politically biased media puts out a poll, they might be trying to get the views of everyone. They might be trying to be unbiased, but the people who are likely to respond to that poll are ones who generally watch or interact with that media company. This is also the same for a lot of non-media organizations which do polling as well. Independent organizations are still susceptible to this. They still have no way of ensuring that they have a perfect sample. So this means that the data is always a poor basis for deciding a vote, right? The third thing under this point is that people are likely to lose enthusiasm for their causes due to polls. So we believe that this happens mainly through seeing that others in their areas don't agree with them. This means that people will likely feel hopeless and give up on their advocacy for a certain cause, right? This is the biggest implication for this is minor political parties, because minor parties are not going to get the major pollings that like a big 2 parties get, right? They're going to get much less polling, and that means people are going to see them as unelectable. So there's no point in voting for them, right? Because they're unelectable. But that's actually not true. And that means that minor parties kind of get pushed out of the political process in favor for a 2-party system. So people are voting based on perceived electability rather than policy. Just to emphasize, we believe that policy is the most important. Do you have a POI?
Yeah. We think that these small parties are worse off on your side because everyone assumes that they're unable to be successful. When a small party actually rises on our side, when there's no poll, no one will have hope.
So we don't agree with that. We believe that when there's no polling, people don't really have any idea how successful the party could be. They're going to get low polling numbers. It's just how the system works. So low polling numbers are likely to push people in that direction. So we also less voter participation in general, not just with minor parties. For example, in the US, you don't have to vote. You might not vote if you don't think your vote means anything. So the impacts of this whole point is just the democratic principle is not fulfilled properly. My second point is the effect on government. So first of all, once a government is elected, polls are likely to reveal that people don't like the government. This is a tendency we've observed. People generally don't like the sitting government. So this means that the opposition can use a downturn in polling for the government to argue that they have lost their mandate to lead and hold up legislation. So this is, of course, an unfounded argument because polling is just observed to decrease whenever the government's elected anyway. All governments have lower pollings when they're actually sitting. So this encourages political congestion, makes policy harder to roll out, and it also leads to worse polling because of that and then exacerbates this issue. So therefore, you get much worse policy in government because of this publication of polling. It also means that politicians fixate on polling rather than producing best outcomes for the people. So that is still something that happens. So for these reasons, I am proud to affirm.
Alrighty. It is exactly through an objective opinion poll that reaches the moderates that we get rid of those opinionated, manipulated, and manipulative approval declarations online that sway elections in bad ways. Couple pieces of framing. Number one, the comparative that on our side. We support the publication of opinion polls on news platforms by the government. We will increase the level of scrutiny and fact-checking for major platforms like the NYT and the Washington Post and require them to publish full reports about their methodology. We have this fiat because they're banning it. But also, we will mandate these news outlets to also put polls by other independent bodies on their platform as well to make sure fairness of representation of different polls and opinions. Note that these polls probably can have breakdowns for different groups, such as age divisions and minorities. Why do we think these polls are likely to be accurate? We think this deals with their material about ingrained bias within these polls as well. A couple of reasons. Number one, we think that first of all, people know to use mainstream, more unbiased news platforms for this because they are more likely to want to see an accurate representation of what the election is about rather than have their views supported in confirmation bias because they actually want to know about the election. This is a revealed preference because they're opting in to the act of looking at opinion polls. Number two, we think news platforms have incentives to be as accurate as possible. They want to maintain users, they want to get more traction, they want to be seen as a credible source. This is especially true for the major news platforms which want to show themselves as an unbiased platform. Number three, we think we have fiat to put a lot more scrutiny on these major platforms and make sure that they show different opinion polls at the same time. So the structural bias of one news platform is mitigated by a confluence of various news platforms. With that said, then, a couple of direct engagements with their material. Number one, they say a principle, which is that elections should be a perfect representation of everyone's views in society. I don't know where you got this from, but that's not the point of an election. The point of an election is to get the option to get the person who is least bad for the most number of people into power and rule the country. The purpose is compromise, to vote the best person into power. The purpose of an election is to elect a leader who makes policy. It's not for people to see what people are supporting. That is what opinion polls are for. That is not what elections are for. So we think you don't want to buy their principle. You should err on the side of opposition, which tells you that the result of the election is much more important, and its representation of the people is much more important. Second argument from them then about the success of small parties. They say that you will feel hopeless if you see that the people around you don't support the same opinion as you. We think number one, this is parallel because presumably you know how your district voted in the past 10 years, right? You've been part of that. You know that, say you're a Democrat in like a largely Republican area, you've seen this district again and again vote Republican. So presumably this issue is parallel. You won't vote anyway. But number two, we think this is worse on their side when these small parties, less dominant parties are starting to succeed because people will continue this assumption that these parties won't succeed and they won't go out to vote. Whereas on our side, polls will actively show that these parties are increasing in their success and support, and this will give people hope on our side. So we flip this argument. The final thing they push to us is that there's less good policies and less decisive policies that come out quickly enough. We think it's far more important that you get policies that is more representative of the vast majority of people than get policies out as quickly as possible. Even if we buy the idea that some policies have a level of urgency to them, we think that polls allow these politicians to fix and edit these policies afterhand. And we think this is very, very important and a benefit to our side. Now onto my substantive about why we empower new forces within established parties. The problem on their side is that without opinion polls, new candidates are unlikely to get electoral success, even if they are popular and representative. 3 reasons. Number 1, we think sponsors and lobbies probably think their money will go to waste if they don't put it into an established candidate, because they don't know whether these new candidates can succeed or not. Number 2, we think electorates have the belief that there's no point to vote for these new candidates, even if they perfectly align with their interests, because they don't think they're electable. Number 3, we think newer candidates themselves are not likely to invest into their campaign that much because they think they probably won't get voted in. The impact of this is that these new candidates, even when they are successful, even when they are representative, are unable to gain any traction. This is bad because number 1, the party establishment becomes entrenched and can afford to become more distant and less representative of the people, more aligned to their own interests. But number 2, when candidates representing more progressive values are excluded, these tend to be the newer values that are entering into the established political parties, right? So why does this get solved on our side with opinion polls? We think there are 3 ways. Number 1, we think it shows the party establishment the extent of increasing support that new progressive candidates are getting. And this puts a pressure on them to make change, to incorporate this progressive values into their policymaking in order for them to continue to be competitive in future elections. Number 2, we think sponsors see that these new elections are gaining popularity, they will fund them. This is the case for Nikki Haley, and this is what got her from like 2% to like around 18% in the Republican primaries. But number 3, we think people don't think that voting for one candidate is a wasting of time because they see that these people are getting more and more support and more success in the party primaries as they come out to vote for them. And they actually have a hope that they might defeat Donald Trump, right? Second argument then on why we're more representative and have strategic elections. The problem on their side is that the moderate electorate is unrepresented with opinion polls before elections. This is because A, wealthy people can voice their policy preferences through lobbying and control of the traditional media. Number 2, we think vocal extreme minorities are heard much louder on social media because they're far more sensational. The impact of this is number 1, politicians pre-elections will make decisions based on what they see in the news, on social media, and with the movement of lobby and power. This is because these views are disproportionately overrepresented. Thus, they ignore the vast majority of moderates that actually make up most of the electorate and most of the citizenship. And this creates an undemocratic election result. But number 2, we think voters are unable to vote strategically in primary elections. This is because they don't know how electable their candidates are. For instance, they might nominate, say, Bernie Sanders because they see support for him online by like far-left communists, and they vote for him. But he is completely unelectable once he gets into the general election. We think this is very bad because this means that the vast majority of the left completely lose representation in the general elections. The solution on our side through opinion polls is that we can get 1, subcategories that show specific demographics like underrepresented minorities and what they want. Number 2, it shows to the voters the electability of the candidates. But number 3, it can demonstrate the preferences of the vast majority of people, the moderate population. Because we're actually able to get a better democratic result for democratic nations, we safeguard democracy, we think we win this debate.
Speaker, a couple of things before I get onto the main clashes in today's debate. First of all, I'd just like to deal with the counter model that Negative tries to fiat in. The first thing that they tell you, and the main thing that they tell you, is that they have a large amount of fiat to regulate polls. Number 1, we tell you that they don't have like as much fiat as they tell you. Like us banning one thing probably doesn't equate to the amount of fiat that it takes to regulate an entire industry, regulate their websites, regulate every single news broadcast. This probably isn't the case. Perhaps they can do this to some extent, but not to the extent that they would like to believe. But second of all, I think that like the idea of regulation and adding fact checkers is quite nebulous. It doesn't like it is just thrown out there. It is not very clear what fact checking means. I think that the systemic issues with polling still does occur as we tell you at first. Like there are still harms that we illustrate. Like so for example, like systemic issues with polling, like who responds to this, how many people are able to be surveyed, which are obviously quite small sample sizes of the population. All these systemic issues still do exist. We also tell you that like these still can be manipulated. Either news broadcasts who are like quite left can just not report on the polls if like a left-wing organization, like a left-wing political party doesn't succeed, or vice versa. They also tell you that, oh, well, they'll mandate that a vast majority of like a smorgasbord of polls will be required to be on their websites. We think that like news websites can be quite conniving. They can just make it extremely hard to access the other ones. Two main issues so far in tonight's debate: effects on voters and effects on government. First, on effects on voters, what do we tell you? We tell you two things. It discourages people from voting. We don't hear a response to that. Second of all, we tell you is that it encourages people to vote incorrectly. They tell you that people actually really have a want to engage correctly with elections, and they actually currently do listen to political polls, and then they also do like valid research. We tell you just like this clearly isn't the case. Like a lot of politics is based on the bandwagon premise, or like who currently is in power or who is most popular. Like, oh, everyone loves Joe Biden, I must vote for Joe Biden because the news opinion poll told me to do so. So quite clearly, I think a lot of our material still does stand. First of all, the unresponded part, and second of all, the responded to part. So onto the material that they give you on this, which is a couple fold. First of all, that they tell you that news outlets won't able to be want to be as accountable as possible. Like news outlets have an incentive to be as accurate as possible. I mean, clearly this is not true. I think that news outlets with like political affiliations don't want to be as accurate as possible. Just like take Fox News and their like incessant whining about like the 2020 election being stolen, or like how voting machines were corrupted by the left, things like this. It is obviously not true that this exists as a major incentive for a large amount of news outlets. Second thing that they tell you is that like the purpose of elections is to elect people who are least bad for everyone. Clearly, this is just quite not the case. Elections are meant to represent, like, okay, perhaps this is the case in elections where you are electing one person, like the American presidential election. Clearly, like, however, in other situations, such as like a parliamentary election, the purpose is to represent what everyone's views are, not what is least bad for everyone. The way that this happens is by everyone elects a representative that represents them, and then they are able to cooperate in parliament. Not just everyone elects the one moderate candidate because it's least bad for everyone. Onto the issue on like effects for government. I think that this is quite important. We give you two main points here, one of which is responded to. The first thing is we tell you that it makes more functional, like it makes governments more functional because oppositions aren't able to question their mandate because like they've been like down in the polls. They tell you that just more representation is good, so this kind of defeats it. We tell you that this is quite intuitive. It is not worth shutting down the government in order for like more representation to happen in the meantime. Like just the large implications of opposition parties being able to shut down the government based on opinion polls is just quite large, and certainly outweighs like the more representation is good argument. Second thing that we tell you is that it's more likely to make decisions for the governments are more likely to make decisions for the greater good, not just for popularity. We don't get a response on this. A couple of things that that opposition tells you. First of all, on the effect of government, they tell you that it is likely to spur. Only one thing that they tell you is that it's likely to spur change in existing parties. They tell you firstly under this that like it shows it shows a large amount of support for political parties can register that there is a growing support for smaller political parties and then change internally. We get this too. All that this motion bans is the publication of these things. What is likely to occur is that political parties still do their own internal polling, right? And so they are able to see the changing demographics. Even if this is not the case, they can probably still achieve this at like election time when they see, hey, a couple of more independents got into parliament this time. The second thing that they tell you is that like people with a lot of money are more likely to fund new candidates now. We tell you that this is probably not true. A large amount of people with wealth, with like a large amount of wealth who have the money to be donating to political candidates probably are quite polarized on the political spectrum and are not going to be willing to like just change their political views because the kids are changing their political views as well. They're probably likely to just keep giving the money to the people whose political opinions they agree with. I'll take a point now if someone has one.
the true comparative on your side is that you're looking at social media to bandwagon. We think that's far worse because you're looking at very divisive.
Okay, I understand your point. I think that this is quite incorrect. I think that social media bandwagoning might be the case, but I think it is far less objective, and people are far less able to actually see that, the vast majority of Americans actually support Joe Biden. I think it is just much more localized to how it currently is, which is just in small echo chambers. Okay, onto my substantive. My piece of substantive is that, like, we get a more diverse political landscape. They kind of give a preemptive response to this, is that people assume that their party won't get up, and so in their world, like, if a small party does start gaining popularity, it is known to people and people will vote for this. People still want to vote for the party that is least worst for them, and so it is really hard for a party, a small party, a third party, to gain a large amount of popularity if people are not voting for it come election time. I think this argument, it really operates quite intuitively, and there are two parts to it. First of all is just to say there is a greater likelihood of, like, legislation-based voting. First of all is that just many vote based on opinion polls, especially those who are disengaged with the political system. What this means that under side gov, they're effectively forced into, like, under our side, they're effectively forced, because of the lack of opinion polls, to at least do some surface level investigations into all the candidates, because they're no longer being told that this person is most popular and that means they're probably good. Second thing we tell you is that there's going to be less tactical voting. That is probably because of the case that people now no longer know whether their third party is unlikely to gain government. That means that if they think that, hey, maybe my third party has a shot, I'm more likely to vote for them. This works both in first past the post political systems and not first past the post political system. Speaker, very proud.
When political participation is in turmoil, when people don't feel represented by political parties, cutting off access to a means of assessing the public opinion is the worst possible thing that you can do. You lose access to what people on the ground want. You refuse change or the feeling of representation. Democracy is a calculus of the masses proud to oppose. A quick point that I want to deal with quickly is that they tell me that they can also access political opinion polls. It's just not published. I think one, this concedes that all the bias and misinformation is given to parties under their side of the house, because probably similar sources or the same sources would be conducting these polls on both sides. But secondly, I want to argue that this is worse because there's absolutely no accountability under their side of the house. If the public wants policy X, but they have that privately, there is no means for the public to hold the governments accountable if that party does get elected, if policy X does not come into fruition. In those instances, it is precisely worse under their side of the house because you do not have the means to hold these parties accountable, because you lose access to it in public. So you lose the major benefit of having these political opinion polls precisely. Two things I'll talk about in this speech then. Firstly, how does this improve elections generally? And secondly, how does this improve the political decisions and policy overall? Firstly, how does this improve elections? With that at the top, are polls biased and a source of misinformation? Before that, I want to clarify something quite clearly, is that opinion polls are not necessarily the same as election projections. It's not limited to who people think are going to win necessarily, but also questions that pertain to policy that are standardized amongst a group of people, as they want voters from political parties, or like what they want to see from the political parties or candidates that they want to see from. This takes out a lot of their material, because their material is contingent on people changing their minds or being influenced by the popular vote. That is not all opinion polls are limited to necessarily. It is a way to get information on what people want when they cast the ballot in the ballot box, but it's still engaged on the definition. Then they tell me two major things under this question. Firstly, that people tend to stay away from stay with news outlets that represent their views and are like biased, and as a result, they stick within that bias and echo chamber. But secondly, that polls are only based on opinion and not actual policy. Insofar as these two premises are taken down, I think a lot of their harms about polls are also similarly taken down as well. The first thing they tell me is that polls are politically biased. I want to note out a logical inconsistency here, because if they tell me that people stay within the same news platforms that reflect their views, but that people also get influenced by polls, presumably then if people stick within the same news outlets, there wouldn't be very many changes. But disregarding this, I don't think bias is as damning as they frame it to be as well, because it is simply a way for you to express what you want as an individual or what you want from these certain political parties. In that instance, having bias is not necessarily going to be a bad thing, but something that's going to help political parties and the public understand what you want as a voter for that specific political party, for instance. Second premise that they tell me is that polls are like based on opinion and not policy. That's okay, because politics is built on opinions anyways. You cast your vote as based on your opinion as an individual. Politics and democracy is that so you're able to express your wants and needs for what that rather than what's objectively good for society, because it's a means for you to express your opinion, for like or means for you to be able to express what you want as an individual. And that is what democracy is about, not necessarily about what is most socially optimal, because people are not a means to an end. I think secondly then, like under our side of the house, we're also going to be able to get better like political they're able to more engage with politics significantly better under our side of the house as well. Because if politicians or political parties look at this data and they see that people are not engaging in politics, or that a lot of people are not even considering voting, then they need more tactics to be able to ensure that people are going to be voting, and that like you can also see other people see where things are going wrong in politics necessarily. This also means that because this comes from a vast majority of different sources, or it's going to be publicized, that there's going to be immense pressure on you to be able to for example, impose certain policies or impose certain things so that people are able to vote, or people want to be able to vote. I think in that instance, we're able to improve overall political participation and engagement overall then. Second question on the improvement of political decisions and policy in general. First thing I want to ask is who gets better overall representation of all parties in politics generally? Because what proposition pauses is that nobody knows how successful small parties are, and the small parties are not really going to get a lot of representation under our side of the house. I don't think the tipping point for success of small parties is whether or not polls exist or not. Historical precedents of larger parties, their ability to appeal to the most amount of people, their massive amount of campaigning resources is not mitigated by the existence of polls. All of these factors still exist, and that's why people tend to have the inclination to vote for these larger parties on either side of the house. This is simply a parallel issue. I think this is the precise reason why. It's because if we cannot fix this issue, it's probably going to be better if we have the opinions of individuals, if we know what they specifically want from political parties, so that they can be represented in the most amount of, as much as possible, so that political parties are able to take into account their voter base, or who they want, who are willing to vote for them, so they're able to improve their policies in the long run. But I want to note that this issue, when it comes to the representation of small parties, is exacerbated under their side of the house without the existence of polls. I think one, people just don't like uncertainty. They don't want to vote for a party if that party is not going to get elected, because then their preferences are not going to get voted in as well. So that means parties are not going to be able to actually enact the policies that these people want necessarily. So even if on our side people don't vote for smaller parties, they can at least use their vote for a larger party that represents their viewpoints better, or they're able to express their wants and needs through these opinion polls necessarily, so that these larger parties are able to take them into account. How does this improve policy to be more inclusive then? The issue under their side that we crucially noted was that wealthy individuals had the most influence in politics, or that those who are the loudest on social media also have the most influence in this matter. What this means is that you have significantly less amount of at least representation when it comes to the vast amount of people. What they tell me is that, oh, actually, you're not representing a vast majority of people because only a few people cannot represent the large amount of population. The difference is that it is not concentrated. Under their side of the house, wealthy individuals are the ones who are concentrating their resources into politics, and that's the reason why they have loudest voices. Or the people who have the loudest voices on social media, they're the ones who have the most concentrated followers. Under our side of the house, this is probably done through random sampling, where you get people from a variety of different backgrounds, so we're able to represent the vast majority of people, or at least different types of people as much as possible in an equal amount. So this necessarily means that even if our sample is not going to be representative of the entire population, it is at least basically varied enough so that you're able to get or you're able to assume that this is a good enough representation, as compared to their side, where it's significantly more concentrated into certain individuals. But secondly, this also means under their side of the house, there's significantly less accountability, because even if they have access to these polls, there is no information that the public gets. This means it is hard for you to vote the government out, because there is no means for backlash, precisely because there isn't publication. If you know that the people wanted a certain policy, but that isn't enacted by the government, then under our side of the house, you're able to vote that government out, or you're able to protest for that government, or you're able to ensure that this government is going to impose this policy. Under their side of the house, because you don't get access to this information, you don't know, and you don't have the grounds to be able to do this. It causes a cycle where your wants and needs are not ever going to be pretty much represented by the government. And I think that's a very harmful cycle that exists under their side of the house precisely. For that reason, because we represent the people opposed.
An election is not won by winning over the voters who have already voted for a certain party for decades. Instead, they are won by winning over swing voters and new voters. And that is where we win. There is no better way to corrupt these stakeholders, the most important stakeholders in an election, than to bombard them with manipulated statistics, telling them different perspectives to hop on the bandwagon of the most votable or electable candidate. This political tampering of publishing opinion polls is undemocratic. Tonight we have explained how it is biased and manipulative throughout the bench, and that is why we win this debate, because we get the best outcomes for the system that runs a country. So, 3 things I'll do in this debate. Firstly, I'll clarify what these polls look like and what their credibility looks like on both sides and weigh that up. Then I'll look at the first issue of how does this affect the voters and what they're going to do in the political system. And secondly, how does this affect the government and political parties and how does it keep them accountable? So onto the clarification. What do they look like? Well, firstly, we tell you that they're done by the media and news. Their frequency is like pretty frequent, especially when there's a lot of political campaigns coming up. That means they're pumped out a lot. A lot of people see them. We think that they're a small sample size and they're often like unrepresentative of what the actual like whole population really think. We think it's an unfair sample. And thirdly, we think that like it's manipulated and biased and it pushes to an outlet's agenda. So what did the opposition then tell us? They told us that they would have the enough fiat to get increased regulation. And they would show things like other independent bodies and make sure like the government overlooks them. Obviously, my second touched on this and he gave a pretty thorough analysis of how this is like still unfeasible. However, obviously you can't like regulate every outlet. We think this wasn't mechanized enough and we think it's too late for them to mechanize it. We think the issues will still occur, the internal issues and the exact basis of a poll in which there is an inherent flaw. We think things like who will actually reply to it. We think that there will always be a bias because the people who reply to polls are people who are politically inclined. We think they're likely to push their own agenda within a poll, even if it is unlikely to be manipulated. We think it is still through an independent body. We think the size of these polls will never be fully representative. We don't think enough people do them. And we think that if we have them out there, there will always be manipulation and misinformation in them. So then we look at the credibility, right? So we say that they push agendas. We think they discourage voting. If we see like a landslide, and they're used to perceive electability and they use it strategically in campaigns to push voters away from voting. Now, what did the opposition say to this? They said that the news has the incentive to be true to keep viewers. We think that as a response, there is an agenda for them to pander to the audience or pander to who is funding them. They think they want clicks. We think they would be conniving in their ways to make money. We think this is unfeasible. So onto the first issue of how does this affect the voters? Now, their first push was that the voters will simply just look at unbiased sources because they want to see the actual polls. Three main responses. Firstly, it will often seem unbiased. We've proved that it's not. We've proved down the bench that it is always like going to have at least a little bit of bias, even at the opposition's best case. We think this is not a good thing, and this is why they need to be banned. Secondly, we think that the voters consume the information and that is what determines their votes. We think they should be able to consume information which is true or information which has come from a more reliable source. And thirdly, we gave an alternative that they will be able to read policies and decide what they agree upon rather than looking at a political opinion which gives perceived electability. Now, the opposition's second main issue was that no voters know how voters know how their area already votes. They think it's unlikely to discourage voters. However, three main responses. Firstly, we said that the new and swing voters won't really know or they might not be politically engaged. And we think that, like I explained, they are the people that win or lose an election. And we think that they are likely to be bombarded. We think they are the most important people in an election because of how they decide the outcome. And for that, we think that it is so important that we ban these polls for these people in general. Secondly, we think that we will get less voters still. We still think that there is a way in which people will see a landslide. We think we will get less voters in places where voting is not compulsory. And even if we are to lose voters, no matter how many, we still think that is a worse outcome. We still think we do better in that. And thirdly, we think that their rebuttal to this was mitigatory and there is still always a harm. So on to their third main point on this of how voters should vote on electability. And this is a direct quote that voters should vote on what they think is who is electable, right? So three main responses. Firstly, perceived electability causes shifts in democracy. This is very impactful because we think that if there is a shift in what people think, then it is unlikely that we get an adequate representation of what people think the policy should look like. Secondly, it causes small parties to lose traction. We will lose a breadth of our system. It is likely to go to a bipartisanship. This reduces the amount of democracy we can get. It reduces the breadth of democracy, and this is obviously worse for the way in which we are governed. And thirdly, if you have a look at a current example of Donald Trump's polling being consistently high, which has forced his competition effectively out of the picture, and he made himself a presumptive nominee through these polls without having to attend any of the political debate. This is proof that a ban would increase the dialogue and improve policies and transparency. It would give more people a shot. It would be more representative, and it is much, much more helpful. So then their second last point on how this will impact the voters, they said that the voters will be likely to engage more. They said so what we say is that they are likely to engage with misinformation or agendas in this, and we think that they are likely to not vote, right? So what do we say? We say that they are able to read political policies for a bare minimum, anyone who is voting is likely to do at least some research. We think instead of looking at the polls and going, oh, looks like they're going to win, I'll vote for them. We think that now the baseline of research looks at looking at their policies and seeing what they actually agree with on a moral level. We think this is a much more beneficial thing for them to do. Yes, I will take a point.
We think that if there are democratic shifts due to perceived electability, this means that the election is more moderate, which is more representative of more people. This is good.
Okay, so I will go on to this in a sec, but your whole case around that point is that an election is about compromise. And the problem with this is affecting the government and political parties. If you are moderating it or meeting in the middle, we think that the compromise makes it more undemocratic. This is also a weak rebuttal to our principle. So 5 main reasons why your POI is wrong. Firstly, the compromise is the foundation of unhappiness. People are unlikely to be happy in a political system where they do not get what they want. We think they are unlikely to be happy if they always have to do something or vote for something they don't truly believe in. Secondly, we get a diverse political landscape. This means that there are more policies, more parties which may be able to form coalitions. We think there is more impact in that. Thirdly, we want to vote on policies, not on electability. People want to vote for what they believe for. Fourthly, we are able to get a better chance at representation. And fifthly, we are able to, like, the lack of polls causes minimal tactical votes, and we get more research as a baseline. So that is what my response. They said that, like, there's no accountability for their parties. So our response to this is that activism still exists. We think that with the voter polls, activism still exists, and the issues will always come up and be forced on them, and they will always have to respond no matter the electoral polls. We think that without them, we are able to get the same amount of accountability, and for that, I am proud to govern.
Proposition is bandwagoning onto an easy case where they prove a problem, then explain no exclusivity. If they hate bandwagoning so much, they need to prove that they solve it. I'm going to go over 3 things in my speech today. 1, are these polls likely to be good? 2, who creates more democratic election results? And 3, a point about strategic voting. Number 1, are these polls likely to be good? I have 2 points here. These polls will be done well, and I have 4 mechanisms. Number 1, there's going to be random sampling, which we proved from the start, and they failed to disprove. But 2, we're going to have transparency. Note that this is going to be done because the public wants transparency. They want to know how this is going on. But 3, different institutions with different incentives from the government will be carrying out these polls. It's inherently unfair for side proposition to characterize polls in a very, very uncharitable way, but never engage on our characterization. Now, 4, about backlash. If the polling is so incredibly biased, it's likely going to be very obvious to the public, and the public will not believe this. Let's give a little bit of credit to the general voting public. They're probably going to notice if they're being lied to from every single news source. So they're probably going to ask for things like the creation of moderating bodies that are going to be good to some extent. At least credit that with us. Now, 2, even if these polls are biased, is it still useful? Yes. Why? 2 things. Number 1, people can see the difference in polling data between news outlets, which means people can see the difference in political biases. It can be used to compare between what the news outlets believes and where they lean. This actually helps them become more well-informed if the information they are getting is inherently biased. But so that creates this external impact that is beneficial for voters anyways. But 2, this analysis is already given at second, but I'll say it again. Even if the samples are unfair and small, you still get a vast variety of opinions. On their side, what they get is concentrated opinions between the people who have the loudest voice, who can be seen in the media, the richest and the most visible people. We say that variety is more important and should be weighed over this, like full stop. I think that's pretty intuitive. But now, is proposition actually able to prevent bandwagoning? No. Going on to the clash of more democratic election results, I want to just ask, is proposition actually able to prevent bandwagoning? The clear answer here is no. I have 2 points to describe this. The long-standing political parties have long-standing. This is also the alternative. Because at least there's proof they will most likely win. This means that people do not want to deviate from what they've currently been voting for and be the first election year to bring the Green Party into power, because there's no proof that the Green Party has ever been successful by seeing the historical attitudes. But 2, social media is actually the alternative to bandwagoning. The subjective perceptions of the news is also the alternative now. They respond to this by saying that people will not trust social medias. 2 issues with this response. like this is inherently not true because the stakeholders of this debate, which are people who look at opinion polls, have a revealed preference for wanting to consider other people's opinions, which means that on your side, without polls, they will still want bandwagon. They actively do this through social media then. But even if this is true, they know that there are issues with social media. They probably also know that there are issues with opinion polls, especially considering that if you search opinion poll, you see at least 5 different results. Lastly, I want to note that this means at best, bandwagoning is the same on both sides, but most likely people are opting into far more adverse and manipulative forms of bandwagoning on social media. Now, what is the general impact? 2 things. 1, small parties are not better off on their side because people are bandwagoning anyways, but 2, they're and that disillusions the electorate even more. Even in a world where smaller parties are gaining traction, then the polling data over time is able to show that then we have that the polling data is able to show that people are slowly gaining interest. The public can actually identify now that, oh, maybe it's time for us to switch over to them and vote for them to be in power now. Maybe it's strategic now, but they're on their side. They don't actually show how people have this increased interest in these smaller parties. There's never going to be a tipping point when people realize that it's now strategic to vote for them. Now, last question within this clash. Will the quality of voter knowledge increase on their side? No. Why? 1 point. They tell us that because of a lack of information and because of a ban on these polls, people will be encouraged to actually look into these individuals more as an alternative. But we tell you that this is not true. Prop actually proves our case. If people are looking towards opinion polls for deciding the viability of a candidate in our world, this means that the substitute they seek is another form of opinion, i.e. social media, people around them, in their communities, their church, etc. They cannot state that the substitute for opinion is going to be well-researched insights into a candidate. That is just not something true. Now, about strategic voting, should voters be able to strategically vote? The strategic voting allows the electorate to push candidates, which is not their favorite, but that they can accept and think that they can be likely elected, more moderate and representative candidates. But 2, they tell us that people want to be able to vote for what they believe for, but if they do not have the capacity to strategically vote, they lose this capability because instead of getting their first choice, and then if they lose out, they get their second choice, what they're going to do is they're just going to lose and get their third choice because they do not have the ability to strategically vote against that. Now, can voters strategically vote in their world? No. Why? 2 points. Number 1, they do not have the information to do so. They do not know if the Green Party is going to be successful this year. They don't know the risk. But 2, if they base their bets upon social media and what they see around them, it'll be really skewed. Now, people will take risks with guessing what the overall consensus is. Rational people may by chance vote for someone who's never bound to win anyways and waste a vote just because they were playing inherently a guessing game. So the implication of this is that if voters cannot strategically vote, it means they are extremely vulnerable to misinformation and this misinformation can actually be crafted by other parties in order to say, hey, maybe you should vote for the smaller party this year because they're going to be successful. But that was actually a ploy in order to get less voting for another party that could have won over them. This misinformation is probably going to exist in their world, especially to a greater extent, especially because voters are looking towards social media more for things like election criteria for who they're going to vote for, but also on top of that, they're going to be listening to people around them to a greater extent. So people who are in close proximities who are also affected by this misinformation that they're going to trust. Now, to weigh, even if we trade off all these polls being good and we tell you that they're completely horrible, we tell you that the alternative is much, much worse. We tell you that people are going to look towards even more untrustable sources, such as social media, such as people who are around them who are inherently they're extremely vulnerable to biases and the social media in the first place, but they don't defend this. Judge, please don't let them get away with this and side with
proposition ever wanted to represent the people in this debate, they wouldn't take away one of the most important tools of democracy, a tool that allows people to express their opinions and improve political parties. It gets rid of a reason that people will even want to vote in an election because they no longer even sure if they'll get represented. I understand why this team was allocated the name bicycle is because they like to cycle away from their problems and act like they don't exist. A couple of strategic mishaps on proposition then. I think firstly, they're limiting what this debate is about. Opinion polls are not just election projections. There's a lot more than that. Opinion polls show what the people want when they're about to cast the ballot, what needs the people want, not necessarily who people are going to think are going to win. So these are different things. This means the information we get about what the people want, what policies are the most popular, this is used by political parties to be able to cater to their potential voter base or to get more voters to even vote in the election entirely. So even if there is bias at our absolute worst, we think that's totally fine because it's the expression of what people want from political parties. A lot of their engagement is disingenuous here because it assumes opinion is bad when opinion is what drives politics entirely. Secondly, proposition is unrealistic. Realistically, I don't know how under their side of the house they're going to get a lot of representation from people, because if the vast majority of people that driving politics are ones who are the wealthiest or the ones who are lobbying the governments or the ones who have the most social media presence, they don't get a variety of opinions that are able to benefit the entirety of society at all. Rather, they have concentrated opinions when it comes to certain people. Those who are more influential have more say in politics. What this means is that under their side of the house, I don't know how they're going to get a vast majority, or how they're going to cover the ground of the vast majority of people, or simply the grounds of the people in general. But third thing is just there's just a lack of response entirely, throughout this entire debate. A lot of their responses were either on the wrong premise or just didn't exist entirely. There was zero response to anything I told you in second, or any adequate response about getting more representation within political parties that we told you at first speaker. I think that alone already proves that their engagement was just not good enough. And I think that's why people on their side will not engage with politics. Why do we win this debate then? I'll talk about a few things. Firstly, just talk about the representation of politics. I'm a little bit confused. I gave you a very clear comparative in second that shows why opinion polls, even at their absolute worst, where sample sizes are very small, are still better. One, there are multiple opinion polls. Sure, they may have small samples, but surely they get different samples of people that have different opinions. But even if the sample sizes are small, they're still selected randomly, so you have different people of different demographics. Maybe under our side, maybe under our side of the house, we don't have a vast majority of or we don't have a bunch of responses per demographic, but we have the variety of demographics that is able to cover the opinions of individuals rather than concentrating onto people under their side of the house. What this means is that we give people equal representation under our side, because one person's opinion is the same, from a racial minority would be the same as the racial majority in this instance. But the second reason is because we get more strategic voting as a result of this. We know what policies are going to be popular, and we can see that people vote for policy, but generally that's going to be a good thing. But finally, we get accountability in politics. Proposition 3 tries to respond to this by saying you still have activism, but it misses the premise of the point that I gave you, because these polls are not publicized. This information is not readily available for the public to access. Therefore, you cannot necessarily hold the government accountable, because you don't know the statistics, you don't know the data that's able to hold you back when it comes to, for example, activism. And activism is probably going to be a lot more successful under our side of the house generally as well. But I think secondly, it's just when it comes to overall general just better improvement of policies as well. I think under our side of the house, because you have these opinion polls, you know precisely what the people want. And I think political parties just have the very basic incentive to get votes to begin with. What this means is that policy is probably going to be significantly better, or going to be a significantly more inclusive, or that politics in the future is going to be a lot more engaging than compared to under their side of the house. Because now you have the people more readily involved in the process of politics when it comes to the election, when you when it influences the outcomes significantly more. We think this is generally going to be a good thing, because it's what people, it's actually showing what the people necessarily want in the absolute worst, even in the absolute worst case on that regard. I think at the end, I want to apologize to Team Bicycle, because I think it's clear that we poked their tires just like we poked poked gaping holes in their case. On that note, it's a clear.
Speaker, at the end of this debate, I'm quite firmly believe that our bicycle wheels remain firmly unpoked. We are roadworthy, and we do cycle to the finish line and win this case. I think it is obviously quite intuitive who gets the best representation on the ground, without a lot of the complicated stuff that side opposition would have you listen to. Just think back down to basics. Without opinion polls, there are much less information being dumped onto voters, swaying their vote. Without opinion polling, people are far more likely to introspect when they come to the ballot box as to what they actually believe, not what they think other people believe. Speaker, we give you many structural reasons as to why opinion polls are completely flawed, and we think that opposition underestimates how badly this invalidates a lot of the results that come from polls. We give you 4 things. We tell you first that polls inherently take very small sample sizes. We tell you, second of all, they're reported by biased news sources. So even if the polls themselves are fine, they're going to be construed in negative ways. The third thing we tell you is that they use bad tactics to gain information. We tell you, fourthly, that the type of people who responds is going to be quite skewed. Note that this last thing isn't defeated by opposition claiming that, well, we are doing like a random selection. No, you can't just say you must reply to me. That person has to actually engage with you. There are a certain type of people who are likely to engage with you, and that is people who are quite extreme in their beliefs and not moderates. You do not, under opinion polling, get quite a good representation of what people actually believe. All of this is to say that they are still quite unreliable at the end of this case. What are the harms of this? We tell you a couple of things down the bench. First of all, that people see opinion polls, faulty opinion polls, and follow the bandwagon. If everyone else thinks Trump is okay, he must be good. This is obviously bad for a couple of reasons. It's unrepresentative and it loses their preferences, which is, I think, what democracy values. The second harm is that people are less likely to vote for small parties. We tell you this for a couple of reasons. That polls are typically like two-party preferred votes, and removing this allows for more support for minor parties. The second thing that we tell you is that polls, if you do show them, are likely to show small parties as losing, and since people vote tactically, as opposition have said, people are less likely to vote for small parties. Third of all, under Gov, this is changed. People believe in their parties and are less likely to vote for them and are able to not vote tactically because they're not sure who's going to win. And third harm we tell you is that people are less motivated to vote as they think that like their side is already ahead. Oh well, Hillary Clinton's already going to win. I'm not going to go out and vote. Oh no, Donald Trump won. So are we able, next question, are we able to prevent bandwagoning? They give us two things. First of all, there is a two-party system. Second of all, social media is where people take their opinions now. For the first point, just see above, we already disproved this. Second of all, I responded to a POI that perhaps people go to social media now, but that only targets people who are in echo chambers and who are already radicalized. Opinion polls go to major news sites. It targets people who are moderates. We have told you this down the bench. This is all to say that likely most of the harms do manifest on their side, but most of our harms do not manifest on our side. I think one of the stronger pieces of their case comes quite late in like the dying minutes of their case, and that is that people will need to take their opinions to other places apart from opinion polling. Since this comes out late, I don't think we have a chance to directly respond, but we do have some implicit responses for our cases. First of all is that you can already air it on other places, whether that be like on your local blog or like going to news outlets, or second of all, I think it's doing it more locally, more personably. We do this better. Speaker, at the end of this case, do not let opposition have their cupcake and eat this too. Please award this to side opposition.